Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast,
a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
Hey everybody, welcome back and thank you so much for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast. Mariano Alvarez here with Brent Labrada and our good friend Tyler Muto. This is going to be episode 3 of our 3-part series on leadership. And so far we've explored how to think and communicate like a leader in our previous 2 episodes. These are 2 essential skills in guiding for both dogs and for people. And today we're going to bring it all together and we're going to dive into what it truly means to lead like a leader. This is where theory meets action. We're going to discuss some real-world applications, challenges, and how to step into your leadership role with confidence. And we're going to do that with some 3 major headings here, okay? So the first one is going to be to set standards and lead by example. We're going to discuss some decision-making and the importance of owning outcomes of decisions that you make. And then the third is going to be how to balance authority with fairness. These are some major points that get in tons of people's way when it comes to being able to lead effectively. And I'm going to kick it over to Brent and let's get things started. Over to you, man.
Yes. I just want to thank Tyler Muto for joining us for our 3rd episode. How you doing, man?
Doing all right.
Excelente. So as Mariano was mentioning, we're going to be talking about some techniques and approaches and strategies on how to help build a team who wants to work for us, who believes in our mission, who, sees a future in the things that we're laying in front of them. Because ultimately being a leader has many layers to it. As we've talked about, making sure that you're thinking a certain way, making sure that you're communicating a certain way. But in these actionable steps, I just want to reiterate, these are going to seem like techniques. And when I say that, I mean, I don't want you guys to just do them inauthentically. Like, I don't want you to just try these things to see how, like the more that you can embody them, the more that you practice them, the more they become natural to you and they come off really authentic, and people will, I don't want you to look at this as manipulation ultimately, right? But practice these things, and the better, the more used to them you get, the natural they're going to become, and the more it just becomes your second nature as a leader. So our very first prompt is set a standard and lead by example. Okay, I want to kick it over to Tyler. Tyler, when people say lead by example, what are some things that come to your mind?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting prompt or question. I think because being in a leadership role, especially within an organization or company, and as you know, I've been not only with my own company, but I served on the board and as president of the International Association of Canine Professionals. It's a very diverse set of skills are required. And so I think kind of like the first thing I want to mention when it comes to this idea of leading by example is you're not necessarily going to be great at every aspect of your role. And that's okay. So for instance, when I first started out, running my team, bringing on employees, so on and so forth, I was actually a pretty terrible manager. I knew nothing about management. I spoke at length last episode about the importance of, if you're going to make that decision to take on employees, make sure you actually understand the gravitas of what you're doing. Like, being a manager is its own skill set and requires the same care and attention as being a dog trainer does. So I was not necessarily a great manager, but I was really good at training dogs, and I had very strong values and principles around dog training. And so early on, when my staff was small, I was still spending a lot of time on the training floor. And so leading by example meant a lot of demonstrating how we were going to care for the dogs and the clients that we were serving. And this was everything from controlling frustration and our own emotions, how we talk about our clients. I think one thing I would see a lot, especially in the community at large, but even among my own staff, is, a lot of client shaming behind closed doors. And so not engaging in that was really important to me, right? To set that example. But it's also possible that you run a dog training business that's very successful, and maybe you're not actually the greatest dog trainer in the world. Your strengths might be something different than what mine were. So leading by example could have more to do with the way you are addressing conflicts among members of the team, for instance. Certainly the way you speak about other members of the team around the team itself when those people are not present, which can be very tricky sometimes. So I think, some of it's knowing your strengths and making a concerted effort to set a strong example of, however I expect my my employees to behave in this regard. Let me make sure that I'm behaving that way also. And then I think the other piece of that is knowing your weaknesses as well and kind of owning them. Recognizing if you have made a mistake. We talked a little bit last episode about, if something did not go as planned, or you tried to handle something and then in hindsight, you sort of immediately go like, that probably did not do that well. Like, just own it. And I think that's also a little bit leading by example as well, because we also want our staff members to own their mistakes and not to just be defensive about it and be sort of just like, I'm going to defend my own ego at all costs in that way. So yeah, I think, it's that delicate balance. I think that's one of the things that makes this entire topic so interesting, but also important, is especially as a business owner, you are always trying to strike this balance between, I've got to set an example, I've got to be on the floor doing these things, but also I can't be on the floor all the time doing it all, because I have to be doing strategic thinking and big picture planning and dealing with crises and so on and so forth.
Yeah. It's interesting because, right now we're talking in the context of like a facility and having employees. And I mean, I'd love to actually kind of see how some of these skills helped you out as president of the IACP. But it can even be on a smaller scale, right? Like if I'm just working with a client, right? Or if I'm coaching a family, for example, which is like a little tiny team, right? Just being able to motivate them to get the job done. And one thing I want to kind of just throw into the mix right now. I've been studying like psychology and like interacting. Like I followed like Tony Robbins and Simon Sinek and a bunch of people that I can't name all of them right now, but through them you kind of I opened up the episode saying you learn moves that get things out of people, and not necessarily you're trying to do that. It's kind of like, I use a cookie to lure a dog. Yes, technically that's manipulation, but it's a technique that we're learning to help teach something, right? And it's easier to teach something when I have a buy-in versus when I don't have a buy-in. And one of the techniques that we learned was talking about belonging cues. And I always think about my mentor, and I think about how he would conduct himself and how he would carry himself. And every morning was a good morning. Every time he'd walk by you, he'd acknowledge you. How's it going today? If you needed help with something, he'd be the first one to grab the box and help you lift it, and some people would just call that good manners, but it's so interesting because sometimes we catch ourselves in this dynamic as the boss, right? It's like, I have 10 people around me. Technically I'm paying them. They should carry the boxes and they should do this and they should do that. But there's this human side. Again, there's a humanity side where if I'm your leader, I'm a human and you're a human. And even though I pay you guys, I'm still going to take the initiative to go say hello and acknowledge you and take care, because I'm not, one of my favorite quotes from Simon Sinek is that you're not in charge of them. People are under your charge, meaning like you are responsible for caring for them and taking care of them and like seeing what they need and being of service to them, right? Have belonging cues or things of that nature, have you guys noticed that to make a difference at all in your relationships with staff, people, clients?
Certainly one thing that comes to mind when you're talking is there's a great book. I can't remember if I mentioned this in one of our previous episodes or not, but it's by Coach John Wooden, who is one of like the winningest coaches in history. He coached basketball, and it's called like Wooden on Leadership. And it's a fantastic book for anybody who is interested in leadership skills. But one of the things he talks about is like the value of like physical contact for that sort of like belonging. Like he made a point every day with every player to like either shake their hand or high five or touch them on the shoulder, but like some sort of actual contact being made there to help facilitate exactly what you're talking about right now. And again, I think it's tricky, right? Because like, I could tell you from my own personal experience, like, again, early in my business, I was on the floor a lot. I was very much involved in the day-to-day. I think it was a lot easier for me to kind of have that role as leader. Towards the tail end of my business, I was already, kind of removed more and more and more from the day-to-day business itself. I was spending much more time in my office working on other projects. And the more that you are in a position of like ruling from the ivory tower on the hill, it becomes more and more and more difficult to actually have the real respect and loyalty of your staff. Very, very tricky. And so the balancing act is like, obviously, the bigger your business gets, the bigger whatever organization is that you're working with, you have to spend time off the floor. Like you can't run a successful business and have it run smoothly and be in the day-to-day all the time. But it's also important to make sure that you are allocating time, like we talked about last episode, to be present, to be there on the floor. And then when you are there, to not just be standing there, arms folded across your chest, critiquing everything that everybody is doing, but actually offering assistance, actually being part of the team in that regard. And where that balance is going to be different for anybody's individual business. But I think that's part of it, right? So when you're in it with them, right, when you're on the floor and you're, like during that time that you have allocated to be on the floor with your team, like a dog does mess all over themselves and need a bath or need a kennel clean, that you are rolling your sleeves up and being part of that. I think that creates a strong sense of belonging, but also, making sure just the simple things, right? Like checking in with your team. How is your day? How are things going? If you know somebody's been struggling with something at home, like asking them about it. If you know they've got a family member that's been ill, asking about that family member, right? Like showing that you care a little bit beyond just the things that affect your bottom line, I think is also extraordinarily important. That's all I got to say about that. Thank you for getting my poor Forrest Gump impersonation with words.
It's my favorite movie, man. It's my favorite movie. I think, yeah, it is. At the end of the day, it's making people feel seen, making people feel heard, making people feel that they are a part of a team or a family, right? And that's what belonging cues are really about. And it's so funny. It's like we get in trouble when we don't do that to our closest friends. We get in trouble when we don't even do that to our own family. You know what I mean? Like, so we are wired, as people to take nicely to these cues and to actually feel certain ways. That's why manners was such a big thing. That's why chivalry was such a big thing. That's why, just people would call it being raised right, but just genuinely saying, I care for you, so let me show you. And it's so interesting because I grew up just the last 2-3 years on this. Okay. And you want to know what really helped me out was running seminars and running events, right? Because it's like, technically I'm in charge of the thing. But the funny thing is everyone's relying on you to be of service to them, right? So if I have someone who's in charge of the food, I got to help them with the food and like be there for them. And I think being a host of big events, being a host of a party, or being a host of a mixer or something like that has really taught me a lot about leading, because I'm running around like a freaking maniac, but I'm doing it for this overall big picture of everyone having a good time. And that's kind of what it feels like when I'm running, when I was running my facility, Are you guys good? Both of you guys leaned in at the same time, and it was like you guys were reaching for the same thing. And so, yeah,
I'm trying to mute you. You're just going on and on. I was just reaching.
Hey, you're like, shut up. Yeah, no. So going back to some of the events me and Mariano threw, it's like being able to coordinate with people and be there for anything you need to get your job done best, anything you need. And it was that stuff that actually, I did a lot of that before I opened my new facility. And it just felt like the same thing. It felt like I'm running around from department to department, making sure I can be of service to you, making sure that I can step in and do those dirty jobs so no one's there to do it. And it's so funny. It's like, that is the type of leadership that I learned very recently, because I used to feel that leadership was just, what's it called I forgot it now. When you tell other people to do stuff, what's that called? Delegating, right? I used to think it was just delegating and demanding things. And instead, it is actually, it's a lot about caring about what that individual who you put in charge of a thing, caring about how can I support you and how can I support you? And even on the human level, like we just talked about, how can I support you? Like just caring about them in their personal life, right? I feel like a big brother to so many members of my team because I genuinely care about them. You know what I mean? Mariano, you there?
So as you guys were talking, a couple of things that came to my mind, I was just writing them down. So 2 things. Tyler was basically explaining, at least what translated in my mind was, when you're with your staff regularly versus when you're not, it's easier to feel disconnected when you're physically, tangibly disconnected. And so anyway, so what this brought to my mind was the degrees of the chain of command in the military. So when I was in the Air Force, I noticed that there's a really smart structure to how they do things. You'll have your squadron commander who's like a major, and then he'll have his person underneath him who's usually like a lieutenant. But you don't typically report as an E3, an E4, whatever, to a lieutenant. You have a sergeant who looks over you guys. He reports to the lieutenant. And to simplify all this, basically what I'm saying here is from a young airman to the sergeant, to the lieutenant, to the squadron commander, that's like 4 levels of separation. And it's really easy to feel judged is kind of a funny word, but it's really easy to feel like, oh shit, Major's here. Everybody like stand the F up, right? And there's this discomfort. And even if they come in with the best of intentions, just to be like, good morning, airman, all the stuff that Tyler was saying, there's this kind of pressure. And maybe it's different, obviously, in the civilian world. But the point I'm making here is a rule I just kind of made up in my head. And if it's wrong, you guys can tell me. I feel like more or less what you guys are saying is try to stay within 2 levels of separation at all times. Kind of being directed and being asked to do something comes a lot better from your sergeant than it does from the lieutenant, even if they ask it the exact same way. And as companies scale and you have more and more managers and all that good stuff, they become your sergeants. And you still have to stay within 2 levels of separation to them. These are now the people that you should be seeing all the time and asking all the questions and doing all the stuff and be seen on the floor. Don't get me wrong, of course, right? But they're the ones primarily who are then going to go out and do what you're asking them to do with the staff, because then they're only less than 2 separations away from someone else. And Brent, when you brought up manners and all that kind of stuff, when I think of these things, which I actually kind of think of a lot these days because my nephews live with me now, I look at manners, like other than just being polite, which is already important in itself. But the reason that it works, I think, the reason it has the effect that it has is it basically removes one whole level of separation, because to show gratitude is to say, I acknowledge what you're doing is something I wouldn't want to do. So thank you for doing it for me. Like, hey, thanks for dinner, because I wouldn't want to cook it and like have to do all the dishes and, let alone plan it and buy it and everything else. So it creates this level of closeness. Like, man, what you did is a really nice thing. I'm acknowledging that, which is to say, I recognize that. It's making you closer by proxy, right? And Tyler was saying, ask questions. How are you doing? And, how's that issue that you've been dealing with, XYZ? It's the exact same thing. I recognize you're struggling and I'm interested in your life. It's removing a level of separation. And so I kind of think about it like stay within 2 levels of separation at all times. I just think that that's a useful, simple skill. But again, I just thought of that. So if it's wrong, you guys don't slam me for it. And the other thing that I thought of was the struggle that I have with this is it's easy sometimes to get lost in your role as a leader. And I'm going to use my nephews as an example of this one more time. So something that my nephews struggle with and my wife struggles with them, and people in our church group struggle with, like all this, everybody struggles with this in all these different ways. And I'm just seeing it all throughout my life right now is everybody's thing right now is like, but shouldn't it go without saying? Like you said, with picking up the boxes and saying hello to everyone in the morning, don't they just know? Doesn't everybody just know I'm happy to see them? Doesn't everybody just know XYZ? And the whole thing with my church group was like, doesn't God know all your thoughts? Why do I have to pray? And the answer to all those questions, again, in my mind, is, yeah, I look at my nephews, I look at my wife, and I can clearly see, clear as day, you're struggling with something. I can see that you're upset. I can see that you're sad. I can see that you're scared. I can see whatever. And even though I see it, it's so different when you bring it to me, because now you're telling me I want to communicate about this. Now I want your input. I want your feedback and so on. And so that's why I think the brilliance of a good leader is, even though you guys should all know it is a good morning and XYZ, I'm going to go through and say it to each of you, because not only am I saying it's good morning, I'm happy to see you, but I'm also by proxy, by the act of doing it, I'm telling you it's okay to do. I'm going to go to each of you and say good morning, because all 3 of us have been in this position where the leader in the group makes it a point, just like you said, I'm going to go say good morning to you, and I'm going to shake your hand and your hand like that, coach. And how quick does it take the athletes to catch on to that? Like 1 day, 2 days, before everybody realizes he's going to make it a point to shake all of our hands every single day. And then they learn the lesson without him having to explain the lesson. The lesson is, even though you boys know I'm happy to see you, I'm going to make it clear. I'm going to make sure it's said. And little things like that I find to be really impactful messages. So in any case, that's what I gathered, was kind of stay within 2 separations at all times. Politeness, showing things that suggest I see a struggle in you that I can relate to, eliminates a level of separation, which is always good. And if you're ever getting lost in your role, like, well, shouldn't they just know I'm the boss? I'm the uncle. Shouldn't they just know? Say it.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because again, I'm referring to my mentor and to see just how he behaved, right? He would always have a smile on his face. He would always be in a good mood. I saw this guy get news that one of his best friends died. And in the parking lot, he's crying. And then when he walks into the building, he's, "Good morning, everyone. How are you? How's it going?" And he's setting this positive attitude tone, right? And I think that's also hard. It's like we have personal lives too as leaders, and sometimes we have to learn. Sometimes our job is not just to lead, is to set a tone, set an energy, set an emotion, right? And also being consistent, right? Just like in dog training, like if the leader comes in sad one day, people are going to be like, "Oh my gosh, what's wrong with so-and-so?" And it makes everyone freak out. But I guess what I want to add to everything we've just said is those belonging cues are not just to help model to people like, hey, we should be kind to each other, we should help each other out, but it's also to model an attitude or an energy or a positivity or a productivity, right? And a lot of leading like a leader or going first is we are the first example of that to our staff, right?
Well, can I say at the risk of sounding redundant to what you just said, not only do I think it's important, I agree, to model the attitude that you want, so to speak, I think that it's important to show other people that it's okay to actively model the attitude that you want. And if that sounds like the exact same thing, what I mean is, if we had to get up early one day for like a really hard PT or like deployment training or whatever, fucking nobody's excited. It's cold in Texas in the winter. Nobody wants this, right? And all of us would be kind of like, "Oh, God, this sucks." And everybody's kind of complaining. And then there's that one guy who goes out of his way, and he's not a leadership, he's just another guy in our squadron, "Good morning, everyone," and he's got like all this energy. And it rubs everybody the wrong way for about a couple days until you start really liking this guy. You just can't help it. And it's not only because he has a good attitude, because he wasn't the only one who had a good attitude. He was the only one who went out of his way to make sure your ass had a good attitude. So that's what I mean by not only create it yourself, like be energetic in and of yourself, but don't be afraid to go out of your way to show people, I want you to share this good feeling, this energy that I have. So I'm going to go out of my way to try to like offer it to you. Now it's up to you to take it or not. But I find that to be really powerful, at least for me. When people do that for me, even if I'm not in a position to like accept it, I appreciate it.
Yeah. Tyler said something earlier. He said, like if a dog pisses and shits all over himself, like sometimes you go first. I'm going to wash that dog for you. Or can you clean that up while I go wash that dog, right? And in one of our points, we have a point that says like leaders go first. There's no job beneath you, right? And pretty much it's like, as a leader, sometimes we just got to get the job done. We got to get it done, and we got to set that pace, and we got to show our staff how it needs to be done. And so we're kind of talking about in different realms, right? Like the saying good morning and having a good attitude, that's like in this emotional realm, right? Like giving good energy to our team is really important, but also the actionable steps, right? If a dog poops and pees on themselves, like I've heard horror stories of some kennels, right? They leave the dog covered in shit all day. And I don't want that to be my standard of care. So if I'm the leader and this is my company, hey, we're getting that dog washed right away. Let's get him cleaned up, get him dried up right away. That is really, really important. Do you have any input on that, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously I agree overall. And I think to kind of touch on one of the topics from last week of like, some of the different leadership styles of being the like disciplinarian versus the like being overly protective versus being the mentor role. And what we don't want to fall into is with all this stuff like, let me check in on you. How was your day? I see you're struggling. That we go overprotective with it, right? This idea of let me make sure you have what you need needs to be coupled with, because I know the greatness you're capable of. So let me make sure that I'm providing you with the things so that you can be great, not just that I'm going to do the thing so that it's done in a great way. You know what I mean? Because you seem to be struggling. And I think that that's a really important thing to sort of keep in mind as we're going through all of this. Similarly, right? Like it is important at times for the leader to get in there and roll up their sleeves and help clean those kennels. But that doesn't mean that if you're in the role of leader, that you should always be cleaning kennels. Because at a certain, like, this is going to sound bad, but there are certain things that just from a sound business practice standpoint, like are below your pay grade. There are certain things that to keep your job as the leader is to keep everybody else employed, right, is to ensure that other people have a job, meaning that the business is running smoothly, that the marketing is going good, that sales are going good, that expenditures are not running too high, so on and so forth. And that requires a whole lot of time and a whole lot of experience and expertise. And so if we're like, yeah, every time there's a kennel dirty, I got to go down there and do it with my team, you simply can't do those things. And the whole team can then suffer, right? So it is a bit of a balancing act that I think is just important to, like, as a disclaimer here for what we're talking about, we don't want to go into that overprotector mode where I have to be there with everything. But certainly there are crises where, maybe you've got a full kennel and you had 2 people call in sick and then a dog poops themselves. And on that day, you go down there and you roll up your sleeves. When you're operating at full staff employment and nobody's overly burdened, everybody has the time to take care of the mess. Like, you don't necessarily need to feel the need to, like, that's the time that you have to get in there. You do have to set that tone of there being some distinction. The other thing that I want to just sort of mention as a disclaimer or a caveat here is, like you mentioned, Brent, the idea of, like, let's not just assume that our employees know that we care how their day is going, for instance, right? Like, it is important to actually say it. The other assumption that I think is very dangerous, that I certainly have had to catch myself, not only with my staff, but honestly also with my children, is assuming that a staff member has a frame of reference to understand how challenging our job might be as the business owner and the struggles that we deal with, and putting that burden on them to understand that, even if it's not just assuming that they know, but even assuming that, like I said, they have a frame of reference to be capable of understanding. So you'll see a lot, and I've certainly have done this in the past, regrettably, where it's like, as a leader, we take an attitude of, you've got nothing to complain about. You have no idea how hard I've got it. And we try to, like, tell them how bad we've got it. If somebody has never run a business, they simply have no frame of reference. You can't explain to them. No different than, and I don't mean to like, for any listeners who have chosen to not have children or cannot have children, but there are certain aspects of parenting that there's just no way to fully grasp the challenges emotionally and everything else that you face unless you've done it, unless you've raised a child, even if it's not your own child. If you had to take care of a child for a loved one who fell ill, or for any, just anything similar to taking care of a parent who might be dealing with dementia, there are certain aspects of that unless you've done it or witnessed it firsthand, it can't be explained to you in a way that you'll understand the same way. And so it's something that I think a lot of people struggle with, where they want their employees to know how stressed their life is. That's not a burden that your employees are responsible for knowing. You have to bear that on your shoulders in a very lonely way, right? Like, and not expect that, oh, well, I need to tell them how good they've got it compared to, like, no, don't do that. It's going to create a lot of contention. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. It just doesn't matter. So again, our employee's job is to essentially take things off of our plate as the leader so that we can focus on larger strategic things and making sure the business runs smoothly. Our job as a leader is to A, make sure they have a job, and B, make sure they have the resources necessary to complete their job. But if we complete their job for them too much, now we are failing to do our job, right? We're simply failing to do our job.
And I think that's a beautiful distinction. And I'm actually glad you made that pivot, because I guess the way I would put it in my head is, like, you go in as support if it's needed, right? Like, you go in to support your staff if it's needed. And again, do the dirty jobs if they need support. But, like, the way I look at it is, like, if I have an employee sitting around doing nothing because I'm helping, then something's wrong there, Mm-hmm. Versus if I have, like, a bunch of fires to put out, like, there's poop here, accident there, dogs have to be rotated and all this stuff, then I'm going to go and see where I can be of service and alleviate the most stress from the team as support, but not actually do it for them. Right?
Exactly. Because in those moments, they may not, if they're, understaffed or whatnot, they don't have the resources they need to complete their job. So that's part of your job as leader, is to provide those resources. And some of those resources might just be your own 2 hands in that moment.
Yeah.
Right.
You want to know something funny is I saw 3 of my employees were burned out one day, early morning shift, and I just go and hand them Celsiuses. And they were just like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. I gave them an energy drink and they were just so happy. And they just started like working real hard. And I say that to say, I want to be the only dog training facility sponsored by Celsius. So Celsius, if you're listening,
Is this Celsius
let us
banned
know.
in Europe?
I don't know, but they're not banned
I'm
in my
pretty sure it's
facility.
banned in Europe
I'll
because
tell you
the
that.
extremely high caffeine content is actually,
You know what?
pretty sure it's banned.
I have a Celsius a day and I am not dead yet. So Celsius, call me up.
More power to you, man. Your poor heart.
Cool. This has been great. I want to take a quick little commercial break if we can, and we will regroup and regather. Next, when we come back, guys, we'll talk more about leading like a leader. See you soon.
Hey guys, thank you so much for listening to Dog Trainers Podcast. You know what's a great way to support this podcast? By becoming a sponsor today. With sponsoring the podcast, you'll be helping us make this show the best it can be, and so much more. From hosting more local events, traveling throughout the country, and connecting with trainers from around the world, ultimately getting you, the listener, more of the content that you love. For more information, please contact us at dogtrainerspodcast@gmail.com or visit our Instagram page at dogtrainerspodcast. Thank you guys, and now back to the show.
All right, guys, welcome back, and thank you again so much for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast. This is our third episode of a three-part series with Tyler Muto. Just before the break, we were discussing the ins and outs and the importance of setting standards and leading by example, and I'm going to kick it over to Brent, and we'll get right back into our second point. Over to you, man.
What's up? Okay, so our next point is making decisions and owning the outcomes, right? I think as leaders, we're kind of put in positions where we have to make choices, and we have to assess a bunch of things: the finances, the workflow, the demand of the business, how many customers we have, all these different things we have to make choices on. And a story I guess I want to open up with is telling you guys a little bit about some of the changes that's been happening in my company recently. So as I told you guys, over the last year, I've been building my new facility and building a team. Years ago when I started my company, my goal, very simply put, was like, how do I create accessible dog education in the city of Los Angeles for the public, right? And so this obviously means, I need to have multiple facilities at some point, right? And in essence, it's like, how do I create a Montessori school for dogs, right? And people can send their dogs to school and come back. And this was my dream for many, many years. Even at my old company, this was my dream. Well, that being my dream and my mission, what tends to happen is I will stay locked in on a plan for like a year, right? And I will build trainers, or I'll build staff members, or I'll build admin. And then I will switch that plan up the next year, right? And over the last 10 months of this new facility that we've had, we've gone from we've gone through like 3 different phases of how we run stuff. So in the very, very beginning, it was like there was a huge separation between kennel techs. There was a huge separation between grooming department, daycare department, and there was a huge separation between trainers, right? And there was kind of this huge division. My first phase of change was getting the kennel staff and the training staff to come together, right? And my final stage is, how do I turn everyone in my facility who works with animals? How do I make everyone either a training assistant or a dog trainer, right? And building this system of learning and education and hands-on, like working with dogs, because my end goal is I want to be able to have a full-fledged training facility, something that I can duplicate, replicate in different parts of Los Angeles, right? And so my team has had to deal with me switching things up every couple months, adding a new protocol, learning a new thing. And at first they were like, oh, this is new. This is so much. And I said, listen, guys, I've thought about it all. I'm going to sit down with you in a meeting and I'm going to switch it. We're going to add these 2 new things and take away these other things. And I need you guys to just bear with me. This is going to work. So everything from the schedule that we run to take care of the dogs, the cleaning schedule. We used to not clean every single day. Now we clean every day. We found the way to clean the whole building every day with the right schedules. How to give the dogs more attention and exercise. We figured all of these things out through just crunching down a schedule and literally like a coach with a stopwatch being like, okay, you got 5 minutes, go and do this thing. All right, good job. Hey, 1 minute warning on the walkie-talkie. you got to do this, you got to do that. And so I just want to shout out to my team because they've had to deal with phase after phase of changes and me making decisions and me switching things up on them. And luckily, I had the foresight to assume how stressful this was going to be for them, right? Because I've seen it done at another facility I worked at. And luckily, I had the foresight to prepare them for these changes. Thank God, pretty much all of my original team I still have, right? Out of the original 25 employees, I have like 21 employees still. And I didn't scare them and they didn't run away. And I look at that as a marker of success. Anyways, this whole long story was for making decisions, being able to deal with these outcomes. I mean, that was my opening story. So there you go. Take it away, fellas. What do you guys have to say about making decisions?
It's really hard.
It's really hard.
It's really hard. Decision making is hard. No, I think, one thing that you said that sort of stood out to me was just like, by the time you made the decision, you had done due diligence, and I think that's really important. So one thing, like, okay, some listeners who follow me independently may know this. Other listeners who don't may not. These days, I actually only do dog stuff part-time. My other part-time gig is I am an intraday trader in the futures market. For the ambiguity of what that means for most people, essentially I'm a day trader, which is all about risk and probability and dealing with our emotions. And one thing there's a big psychology component to it. And the psychology of trading is very similar to sports psychology and thus very similar to any other performance-based activity, right? And one thing that came up with one of the psychologists that I follow in this realm, who also used to work with military, was the importance in understanding the difference between risk and uncertainty, and also understanding that our brains and our emotions kind of process those two things like the same, even though they're kind of technically not. And so anytime we make a decision, or we have a decision to make, I should say, we're always going to have there's this sense of fear before you pull the trigger, right? Like you're always a little bit, I mean, if it's a meaningful decision, right? Maybe you're going to go on a new marketing venture and got to sign a contract and it's going to cost a lot of money. Or it's a big change to the way your staff is operating and it could, sort of backfire, or there could be some fallout from it or whatnot, changes to your programs or pricing, etc. These are scary decisions to make. What we want to do is we want to make sure we're doing due diligence enough that we understand the risks involved. We shine as much light on this as possible, and that we then accept those risks wholeheartedly. So obviously this makes a ton of sense if you think about day trading, right? Like anytime you hit the buy or sell button, you are putting capital at risk and you need to accept that, or you can make very poor decisions otherwise. But it's certainly even in the realm of business leadership or military leadership. And the problem, though, is that no matter how much we do our due diligence and assess those risks and say like, okay, I know my worst case scenario, I know my best case scenario, that's a pill that I can swallow, I'm ready to pull the trigger here, you're probably still emotionally going to feel this like sense of fear. But a lot of that fear at that point comes from uncertainty, because no matter what, right, there are very few decisions you're going to make as a business owner where you can predict the outcome with 100%. You know what I mean? But if we've done our due diligence, if we are sure that we assess the risk properly and we've accepted that, then we shouldn't let that type of fear inhibit our decision making. And that's a really important thing to think about as a leader, right? Because if I'm feeling that fear and I haven't done my due diligence, then that fear is telling me something very, very important, that I need to do more research into what could go wrong here. Right? But you have to understand that even after you've done that research, you still might have this little feeling in the pit of your stomach. And we have to say, is this due to actual risk? If it is, then maybe I haven't fully accepted that risk. Maybe I've told myself I have, but I haven't really psychologically. I'm not prepared to deal with the ramifications if it goes wrong, because as a leader, it's on you. If your staff follows your orders and it leads to an unintended outcome, that's not on them. That's on you. They followed your orders. That was their job, right? So, but at the same time, I deal with, when I'm coaching trainers, a lot of people that get into this sense of paralysis when it comes to making a big decision. Maybe it's a new website, Maybe it's expanding their program offerings. I've helped multiple trainers over the past year or two with expansion into facilities, from being sort of like a home-based operation to leasing their first property or even buying their properties. And they can get really stuck. And so, when it comes to those decisions, I actually have spreadsheets that are kind of pre-built that we plug numbers into, and we run all these different variables, different scenarios that can produce different outcomes, so that we're shedding as much light on this stuff as possible. So that was kind of the first thing that came to my mind when you started talking about decision making and the fact that we as leaders need to own it. Yes, we do. But it's also important to A, make sure you're doing that proper assessment of risk. B, make sure you are truly and fully accepting the risk that you're taking, right? Once you pull that trigger, you have to accept that risk, because if you pull out without letting things play out, it could be, death by 1,000 cuts kind of situation here, right? But then 3, also understanding that if you've done that risk assessment, you might still feel some fear or trepidation, but don't let that hold you back, because that's just uncertainty. And there's always going to be uncertainty. There's always going to be uncertainty. We want to remove as much of it as possible, but in many cases, we can't remove all of it. And making big leadership decisions is, by its nature, scary. And that's why not everybody's cut out to be a business owner. Some people know that. I have a friend who's a dog trainer who's very well known, definitely like a thought leader in the dog training world, but has chosen essentially his entire career to work for other people. Like, he just knows, like, he does not want to deal with all the things that come along with actually running the business itself. And I respect him for that. You know what I mean? It's a very conscious decision that he's made in that regard. So I don't know if that's exactly where you were going with this question, but that was sort of the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah, I think that's huge, because being able to assess the risk, I was fortunate enough to work for another facility for 10 years and be kind of a part of some of the decision-making process. And then, when I was building a company, again, from the bottom up, from 1 employee to 10 employees, there was a lot of learning things that I learned firsthand, not just, secondhand. But I think, being able to understand, like, this is my team, this is how they might act, this is the best thing that could happen, this is the worst thing that can happen. Would I be okay if, like, whatever happens in the middle happens? Like, those decisions, that skill to assess risk is really important, because what I would also say is, like, every single move that I've made has been for the betterment of a lot of things. It's to align closer to my mission. The people who I've made the decisions for, they've made more money because of it. Their job has either gotten better in some way, shape, or form because of it. And so I'm starting to, in my business, I'm creating this track record of, like, I'm winning. Like, every promise that I make is better, right? And so what that kind of does is it kind of helps build this reputation for me as a leader, where, I'm making good, risk analysis, and I'm also able to make ideas and execute ideas that are just leading to everything getting better. And so it just makes people have more faith in you as a leader, like being able to make those assessments. And my reputation is being based on, like, he knows what he's talking about, even though sometimes I'm casual and goofy. Like, this computer's working in a way that's really that is good. And that's kind of, I surprise myself sometimes, where I'm like, wow, I didn't know that was going to be that great of an idea. But it's cool. It's really cool. Is there, let me ask you this, is there a way to build, other than experience, is there a way to build the risk analysis skill?
Absolutely. First off, like, a lot of it is a numbers game in a lot of ways, right? Like, so there's a lot of decisions that we make as a business that it's just a simple matter of math, right? Some of it's definitely going to be experience, but I think it's also just a matter of slowing down and not shooting from the hip, right? Like, taking that moment to pause before we react or do make a decision. I could share a story, like an actual real life story of something that happened in my business, like a decision that I made. So around 2017, 2018, we were doing our board and trains like most people do. Dogs are staying with us, 7 days a week, so on and so forth. And I was running into a lot of issues with staffing around the weekends. It was hard, the way my business was structured, to rotate who works on the weekends. That wasn't going to work for the way that we ran our programs. And so it kind of ended up being like, the lower ranking employees or whatever, like some people just didn't really have a choice. I don't even want to say lower ranking employees. It was just sort of like the way it worked out, right? Like, some people just sort of had to work weekends, and it was always this sort of point of contention. And then for myself personally, On the weekends, if somebody called in sick, it was a lot of times for like on a Sunday morning, I would have to go in, which I would ultimately find. And to a certain extent, I actually used to like working those Sunday mornings. It was quiet. But after I had kids, it was a lot more difficult for me. I wanted to be around with my family on the weekends and help my wife around the house and things like that. And so I started talking to my management team at the time and spitballing around some ideas. And we started saying, what if we sent dogs home on the weekends? What would that mean? What would our programs have to look like? What would have to change to make that happen? What would we lose? Because at the time we were also, if we're open 7 days a week, we offered boarding to existing customers. We didn't do a ton of boarding, but we regularly would have, not only our board and trains, but also a few boarding dogs. And of course, if we're not staffed on the weekend, we can't, like weekends are the most popular time for board. We're going to lose a ton of that boarding business. So we figured we could model the board and trains where we offered enough bonus with this that we didn't have to change the pricing of the board and train, right? Like we could offer, for instance, more lessons in place of that weekend time, which is what we ultimately did. But we lost boarding revenue. We lost private lesson revenue from the weekends. It's very popular private lesson time. So on and so forth. What would it mean for staffing? All these different changes. And I took a ton of time and I just filled pages of a notebook, just running all these things, best case scenario, worst case scenario. And I ran the math on it. At the time, my business was running very profitably. And so while we did recognize that we were going to lose some revenue, I ran all the numbers and I knew exactly how much revenue I stood to lose, worst case scenario, but also how much my payroll liabilities would change, so on and so forth. And ultimately, it did make my business less profitable, but we all have different values and priorities on things. And maximum profitability was not my highest priority. I had a threshold of profitability that I needed to ensure we hit, but we were well above that prior to this decision. And then later on, I was having an independent valuation of my business done, and I had to hand over tax returns and things like this. And I remember the person who was valuing the business got to that year that we made that change, and they went, "Whoa. What happened to your business in, 2018 or whatever?" And I just looked at him. I said, "I made a decision." That was my response. I just said, "I made a decision." So I knew exactly what was going to change from a P&L standpoint. Like I was fully aware of that. And so when we started to see our reports from that year, if we're tracking our profit and loss statements, et cetera, when it comes tax return time, so on and so forth, at no point was I starting to sweat bullets. Like, oh my God, we're making less. Like, am I going to have enough to pay the? I knew exactly going into it. I knew what I was gaining from that decision. I knew what I was losing from that decision. And I made the decision eyes wide open. So there was no angst about it at that point. Was there still, when I first was like, okay, I'm going to have a meeting with the staff and announce this big change and we're going to see how it goes and see how the clients like it and this and that. Was there still some angst around that? Of course. But when I saw the numbers coming in and the differences in my income on that first month, for instance, did that make me nervous? No, because it was exactly what I expected to happen. It was exactly what the math played out, right? And it was just simply a choice. And I was happier and my staff was happier and actually our clients were happier. And we actually found some unintended benefits of changing our program that way to the point where I honestly would never go back. It just there was a lot of improvements that happened because of it that I'll save for a different discussion. But kind of point being, it's just taking that moment to say, hey, like, what if we did this? Not just going like, let's try it, but like, we just literally, it's just a math problem at the end of the day. Like, it's really just a math problem. Sometimes it's not just a math problem, right? Sometimes it's a decision that has to do with company policy that will affect your employees. And we have to think about like, well, how might this get perceived by them? What's the effect on morale, by them? We spoke about some of this last time about like, before you go into a conversation with an employee, just pause and say, okay, if I was on the receiving end of this, would I receive it the way that on the presenting end, I'm trying to present it? Like, is this meeting my goal here? And it's just taking that extra bit of time to plan and prepare. You know what I mean? So I think that's the ultimate skill. It's really a skill more of discipline than it is of actual, like, you don't have to learn how to be a risk manager, right? Like huge corporations have risk managers, or risk, like insurance companies have people whose job it is to assess risk. Like, you don't have to learn that skill set. What you have to learn is the personal discipline of not shooting from the hip. You know what I mean? Of just pausing, planning, and preparing before any decision that could affect your business or the people in your business.
Yeah. That's a huge lesson that I learned from my mentor was like, let's do the math on it. You know what I mean? Like I had this wild, wacky idea because I'm more of like an artist in nature, you know, and he'd just be like, oh, let's run the numbers and see what it is. Anytime I'm like, hey, I want to charge this for this class, or I wanted to charge this for this service. Even now he helps me with it, you know, like I just upped my prices, like by $1,000, just up my prices. It's like, how's this going to affect our clientele and stuff like that?
And then you go like how many clients can I afford? For instance, let's say that I up my prices by 25%, but then my sales dip by 10%. Where do I land? You know, kind of knowing where those thresholds are, right? You know what I mean? Because that'll happen. At one point, we did the same thing. We used to offer a 2-week board and train. And at one point, everybody, like myself and my staff, we hated it. And we're like, well, what if we just didn't do anything less than 4 weeks? And again, that was simple math. We realized that, because like some of the staff was like, yeah, but what if some people can't afford it? And I was like, listen, if we only offered 4 weeks, we can literally sign up 50% of the people and still be exactly where we are right now.
Mm-hmm. It's crazy.
You know,
right?
we can lose 50% of our sales and be exactly where we are right now. So a lot of times it is a math problem at the end of the day.
No, and I love that. And I forget who it was. It might have been Michael Ellis we were talking about. We're just talking about like having the dual side of the way you think of like, you can be optimistic, like you can be a dreamer and a positive thinker and like think everything's going to work out. But at the same time, there's this pragmatic side that needs to also be developed. And, you know, and sometimes you need to be pessimistic, right? Like, but it's about learning how to understand those different realms of thinking in order to see a vision clearly, right? And we didn't really touch base on that 100% in our first episode, but I think in order to make decisions, you got to be able to live in those different rooms, you know, at different times, you know?
We kind of did in the sense of, you know, we talked about the fear setting worksheet. Tyler had said something earlier today, as well as in our previous episode, about people, including staff in a company who haven't run a business. They don't even have a frame of reference for the stresses and the ins and outs. So I extrapolate that to also mean, if we're telling someone you have to make sure that you think it through and you consider some contingencies and some risk managements and where do you land and all these numbers. Some people hear that and don't necessarily have a frame of reference of like, how much thinking should I do? How many numbers should I crunch? And then they can easily overanalyze and get stuck. And the whole point of this is to make decisions, right? And that's why, because I'm a major overthinker myself. Like I'm totally guilty of this. That's why I'm so quiet while you guys are like talking and I'm just kind of learning. But the one thing that I've learned about this that I feel can help people is, if you don't know how much thinking is thinking and how much more thinking is overthinking and when should I stop thinking and start doing, try something like the fear setting worksheet, because by its nature, by its design, and you can Google that, fear setting worksheet, it's everywhere, it's free, right? By its very design, it not only forces you to explain a lot of these things, what is the worst case scenario, but it also forces you to explain, if worst case scenario did in fact happen, what would be my plan B? Because by nature, you know, if worst case scenario does not happen, you know what plan A is. That's what the decision is. That's the point of the change that you're trying to make. But once you've filled this out and you know what worst case scenario looks like, you know what you're going to do in order to get yourself out of this situation, then start acting. And don't think too much beyond that, because then at a certain point, you're just going to go nowhere with it. And now it's kind of like having money in your bank account versus money in the market. It's like, it's not going to earn you any. It's just sitting there now. So once you've thought out your action to a point that is sufficient, like Tyler said, if you've never done this before, you have no frame of reference, you're still going to feel underprepared because this is something you've never done before. But start to decide for yourself, and I tell this to clients and staff and stuff often, there's got to be rails on what you're doing. Like you've got to hit a limit somewhere, and that also includes time that you're going to spend battling back and forth in your mind, logically explaining why this one's right and that one's wrong, and then vice versa. So kind of establish for yourself, I'm going to come up with best case scenario, worst case scenario, what's going to happen, like what do I do to fix worst case scenario? And then once you've done a few of those, stop thinking and start doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I love what you said about like having a plan B too, you know, like sort of knowing where's your stop out point. Like what would happen that would sort of invalidate, you know, this whole idea. There was an interesting study a long time ago, and I don't remember what it was called or who did it, but it had to do with the process of, I don't want to say visualization because I don't mean visualization in the traditional sense, but it's a very popular practice, right? Like if somebody wants to grow a business, for instance, they would say like, okay, I want you to like put yourself 10 years in the future and imagine that a newspaper article has been written about the success of your business, right? And just how wonderful things have gone. Everything's gone exactly as you dream it to be. And what are the kinds of things that are going to be reported as being like, this is how you were successful. But what was interesting about this study was they had one group of people, it was a long-term study. They had one group of people do that with their goals, whatever their goal was. And another group of people that did the opposite. So put yourself 10 years out from now and it failed. And what were the things that led to its failure? And visualize those things. And the people who did that, it was a statistical significance in the likelihood of them actually achieving their goals. It was like that you were significantly more likely to achieve your goals if you had done that sort of negative projection versus the positive projection, that you've anticipated the speed bumps, you've anticipated the problems that can occur and thought them through. Those people were more likely to achieve their desired outcome.
I've seen that, and I think that that's not only so true, but I want to say that the logic behind it was twofold. It was not only a matter of belief, because that's what people think of when they think visualization. They think like meditation, right? Which is valuable. Yeah.
It is valuable, but it's different than what we're talking about here.
Right. What we're talking about here, correct me if I'm wrong, because I had to do that as part of that worksheet I keep bringing up. I know that you guys listen.
What made me think of it? It seems very similar to the fear setting worksheet. Yeah.
Right. And for people on audio, I know you can't see this. You can catch these on YouTube, by the way, the video version. But just so that you're aware, I'm holding up my notebook from this program. And it's a bunch of things, but at the very bottom of it, this text is really small, and I'm sure it's backwards, but what it says is basically...
What was that about? You're afraid people were going to make fun of your small hands or something? Could you hold that closer to the camera?
Yeah. I wasn't afraid of that until right now, Tyler, with the succulent zingers here. No, so what it said at the very bottom of the page there was not exactly, it wasn't like a newspaper article, but it's what Tyler was saying. The prompt is dream character image. I want people to look at me in the future and say, this guy is this. And I start listing out characteristics that I want to embody someday. And then you start working on the fear setting worksheet and the goal setting worksheet and so on and so forth. Because what Tyler was saying is, it's not just about believing. Obviously, that's important. It's also about, don't smile, Tyler. This is not the thing, and don't stop believing. It's
I was still thinking about small hands. I was thinking about a comment somebody made to me one time, because I actually have small hands.
Better use my strong hand.
And I was told one time by a local pet store owner that I had carny hands. That's what I was smiling about.
That's from Austin Powers.
Yeah.
Little hands. Carnies. Circus foot.
Is that what it's from? Okay, I thought he made it up. He's not as clever as I thought he was.
No. Next time you see him, slap him with your small hand.
Anyway, continue.
Yes. So the other benefit of being able to write out your sort of dream character image, other than belief, the other benefit is clarity. So many people, when it comes to who they want to be, they've never put it into words. Who do you want to be? And Tyler has spoken in the past about so many of your thoughts, because everybody thinks about who they want to be or what they want to be, or they see somebody in a movie or whatever, and they're like, oh, I'd like to be like this. Like, you think about it. But if you don't take time to write it out, you don't realize how discombobulated and incoherent your thoughts are. So when you do exercises like these, you start to realize how many blanks there are in your mind. And this forces you to proactively fill them in. And then one step further than that, Tyler also mentioned in the past, half the benefit of writing notes is going back and reviewing your notes, which is why this worksheet is a worksheet in a notebook that I can look at forevermore, so that you can go backwards and see, these are the character, like qualities that I said I wanted to have. And if they change, make a new one. But now you still have a visual representation that you can see evolving in real time. But the point is, basically the point of all this stuff is, do the work, just as in take action, but before you do, by what metric do you measure? And I guess what I'm trying to get at here, and keep in mind, you guys, shameless plug, Tyler does this for a living, guiding people on how to do these things. You have resources out there. If you don't know how much thinking to do before taking action, reach out to people who can help you. And Tyler's not the only one. He's just a great option, right?
So the best one.
The best one.
I'm not the only one. I'm
right.
The best one.
Exactly. The best one. He just wasn't going for the best team, but he is the best one, right?
And hey, wow. Oh man, my Bill's mug is empty, but I'm going to pretend I'm drinking out of it.
But yes, just to bring it back, sort of a dream characterization thing, what Tyler was saying, like, who do you want people to see you as? Who do you want to see yourself as? Literally write that stuff out and go back and review it. And then the ways to make it happen and not overthink. There's the goal setting worksheet we've talked about. There's the fear setting worksheet we've talked about. And there are resources like Tyler to help you get to where you need to get.
Agreed. I love that. That was actually a really good section. I wanted to move over, unless you guys had anything else to talk about in this section. The next and last section that we're going to talk about before we wrap everything up is balancing authority with fairness. And I'm going to use an analogy that I like to use with a lot of my clients when it comes to with their dogs, right? And how we develop. We actually did an episode on authentic authority and kind of like how that is developed from the beginning early on. And we were actually talking about with owners and their dogs, but I'd love to get your input on this as a parent, Tyler, and kind of tell me what you think. So, I always tell people, authority isn't developed when you get an F in school, and authority isn't developed when you beat up your brother, right? That's not when authority is developed. Authority is developed by small, doable tasks that our parents demand from us, right? Like, go wash your hands, or, hey, how about you go put your PJs on, or eat those vegetables, or, hey, it's time for bed now, right? And there's these little moments where we have these requests or these expectations, and we insist upon them being done, right? And kind of what the end goal is, how do we develop cooperation, like willful cooperation within the system, right? And I always tell people, I used to get in trouble for not washing my hands. I used to get in trouble for not, saying please and thank you. I used to not get the things I wanted if I didn't do these things, right? And I always talk about, being a kid, learning to respect my parents started with the reinforcement of these really small tasks and these really small expectations. And I would say that there's a parallel with that when it comes to business. But you as a parent, Tyler, having kids, what do you think about that concept? Is it valid, or do you want to add something, destroy it, whatever you want?
Oh, I think it's 1,000% valid. There's a million analogies from parenthood. I'm going to just go back, though, really quickly to John Wooden. And I think I may have used this example in a previous episode, but it could have been a different conversation that I'm thinking of in my mind. So one of the things that he was known for was kind of sweating the small stuff to a certain degree. His first thing with all of his players was that he was very specific about how they needed to put on their socks and lace up their shoes and tie their shoes, with the idea being that, you're spending a considerable amount of time running around on a hard floor. If your sock is bunching up and causes a blister, that causes you to favor the other leg, that causes you to sprain an ankle, that causes you to miss a game, that causes you to miss the championship, right? So it's these little things that do build upon each other. And this is very serious. Like, he literally was like a stickler about making sure that everybody put on their socks and laced their shoes up properly before every practice and every single game, right? Just setting that tone. But it is those little things that then also set the tone for them to follow further guidance from him. And I can tell you, absolutely, as a parent, you can, and I've seen this also with friends and family members that I've witnessed as their children have gotten older, that they've lost control. But you saw it happening when the children were 5 years old, with just little things like bringing their plate over to the sink at the end of dinner, or it's a little grainy, I can't see what you're holding up, but is that the Wooden on Leadership book? Yeah, it's a solid book, man. I'm going to give another book recommendation too that also references that book as well. But, so yeah, like, definitely as a parent, it is those things. And so it is sometimes little things. In a training facility, it could be as simple as, again, like, how are we going about cleaning kennels or cleaning the floors? It could be as simple as making sure that every time you walk a dog on a prong collar, that you have to back up on that collar a certain way. It could be as simple as making sure that every new client gets a follow-up email after their first lesson or something like that. Being sticklers about these little things, it does set a culture, but it's the little things that can snowball into far bigger things later on. So yeah, I would agree with that 1,000%. The other book recommendation I want to make, I'm actually reading it right now, but I've read multiple of this author's books throughout the years. The author is Ryan Holiday. Excellent. Daily Stoic, Obstacle is the Way, all great books, but I'm currently listening to it in audiobook form currently. Discipline is Destiny. But that book is filled with stories from exceptional leaders throughout history. He actually references John Wooden in the book. He also references people like Angela Merkel, Queen Elizabeth, President Eisenhower, so on and so forth, to discuss the different effects of discipline. But in a lot of those cases, those people were also leaders and how this all affected them. And that's what I was mentioning earlier. Like, it is some of like the risk assessment stuff. Like, it's less about learning the skill of risk management and more about developing the discipline of just taking that pause ahead of time before making those big decisions. The discipline as a parent, I actually, in my journal, we've talked so much about journaling, but in my journal, I had a note to myself about that I need to be better about, making sure that I ask my kids every day to help set the table. And then, following through on that, like if they say no, right, that translates into no dessert or no screen time after dinner, right? Like these are the little things that I'm asking you to contribute around the house to understand that we're in this together as a family, and running a house is difficult, and you're capable of doing these things. I know you are. But it's very difficult as a parent, and then also very difficult as a business owner to attend to these little things, right? We have to be extremely disciplined as leaders to create these disciplines in those who we lead. And I recognize that as a parent, I was not doing a good job of that. And so then when I would ask my kids to do something like that and they would say no, and I would get upset, but I haven't been consistent about this, right? I haven't made it predictable for them, both the expectation and the outcomes of if they say yes or no. And so then it becomes very difficult for me to have any sort of accountability for them if I don't do that. And it does start with very small things. If I can't get them to help set the table, how am I going to get them to make sure that when they're of age that they get a job and start learning to support themselves, that they do good in school, that they treat their teachers with respect, that when we're out in public, they behave appropriately if I can't even get them to understand responsibility in the quiet of our own home, right? So yeah, I think you're spot on with it starting with these little things 100%. If you let the little things go, you can't enforce the big things. You've lost control at that point.
1,000%. And from a business standpoint, a professional standpoint, like showing up on time, right? That's a traditional one. Clocking in, right? Like people who are like, oh, I forgot to clock in. Like just clock in, dude.
Dressing appropriately.
Dressing right. Dressing whatever your company's code is. And that's so funny you said that, because I mean there was a time I came in like early on when we opened the facility where I wanted everyone to be good and look good in uniform, and then I came in with a fucking fucked up hair and like dirty shoes, and like so I had to check myself on that consistency. But one thing that you brought up was how important the consistency from you is if you want the consistency from your staff. And I always make that analogy even with dog owners. I was like, an out of focus dog owner has an out of focus dog. You know what I mean? Like if that person is constantly, talking to people, their dog's constantly dragging them on their leash. If that person cannot put the attention and intention required to get the job done, and their lack of consistency, or their consistency is not going to be there. You know what I mean? That's really interesting. Anything you want to add to that?
Me? No. I mean, I think it's an incredibly valid point. Yeah, you got the book right there. Discipline is Destiny. All of his books are great. I recommend following him. Ryan Holiday, follow him on social media. Even he posts some really great things. He's sort of an expert in Stoic philosophy, which is really just the philosophy on how to be a good person and live a life of decency. I think the only other thing that I kind of want to mention now that I think about it is, we've talked a lot, I think, Mariano mentioned about like thinking about like, who do you want to be? Like what does this role look like for you? Is there somebody you admire that you want to model after? And I think one thing that people, when they're doing that, I think not a slippery slope, that's not the appropriate term, but a sort of trap that people fall into is they think about the outcome that they want, but that doesn't mean actually like being that person, right? So you can look at somebody, for instance, like a great athlete or something like that, like, oh man, I want to be like that person. But okay, so what does that truly mean? What time does that person wake up? What is their diet like? What is their exercise routine like? What is their discipline about going to sleep at a decent hour? What things are they saying no to? What events that their friends are having fun at do they miss? That all shapes becoming that person. And so if we're thinking about those things, like who do I want to be? How do I want people to see me as? I want people to see me as this. Well, then it's not just acting like that person outwardly, but again, going back to those small things, it is all the small little routines and disciplines that that person has done that made them that way, right? Like it was Aristotle that said, are what you repeatedly do, right? So if you truly want to be like whomever, right? You want to be like Michael Ellis. You want to be great. Like, what time does Michael Ellis get up and go out there and start working his dogs? How many times a day does he work his dog? You know, does he drink every night? Does he because that's what it is actually going to take. You can't just watch a bunch of his videos and then try to talk like him and stand like him and move like him and pretend you're Michael. Michael built his career over a long period of time with a lot of sacrifice and a tremendous amount of discipline. And that's what we then need to be writing down and being like, okay, cool. So now these are the actions that if taken repeatedly, right, we are what we repeatedly do. These are the actions that if taken repeatedly will turn me into this type of person, right? So if your image of yourself is like, oh man, I'm so lazy and da. Okay, cool. So pick one action that's not lazy, right? If it's just one thing, like waking up a little bit earlier, and do that. And then you can look yourself in the mirror and say, no, I'm actually the kind of person who wakes up at 6 a.m. every day because that's what I've done for the past 3 months. I'm that guy now, right? Yeah, that's kind of leave it at that, I guess.
That's beautiful, man.
As you say that, it basically says to me, it's not what you do, it's who you become along the way. I know that's a quote from someone somewhere, but the whole idea there, like you were saying, is if you want to have what someone else has, or if you want to earn what someone else has earned, you know, because then you hear all those stories of people who like hit the lotto and then go poor again, stuff like that, because they never had the skills that would have enabled them to earn this amount of money, which is why they never did. And when they have it, they don't know what to do with it, right? In order to be able to live the lifestyle that someone else has earned, you have to embody the characteristics that enabled them to earn it, right? And just a couple things I would want to mention on that very quickly. The first one is from an old book that I love. It's like from 1908, written by James Allen, and it's called As a Man Thinketh. And it's a really
Great
short
book. Yeah.
Oh, oh, cool. Okay.
I read it. Yeah.
Great. And there's a very simple quote in it that says something to the effect of, a man can be successful regardless of his vices, just like a man can struggle regardless of his virtues. And I think I bring that up because there are people out there, well, everybody out there, myself included, obviously, is they have their upsides and their downsides, and they often confuse which is which. Somebody can be successful and still struggle in some other area and think that they're not struggling because the bank account shows that I'm not struggling. But it doesn't mean that if you were to mitigate or eliminate this vice that you wouldn't be even better off. Or it doesn't mean that you're struggling. That doesn't mean that this characteristic that you have isn't a virtue. It's just outweighed by the vices. It's kind of the whole, how much hot air is in the air balloon versus how many sandbags are tied to it type thing. And so little thinking like that helps you decide what's a pick me up, what's a put me down. And if the goods outweigh the bads, you'll still be moving up, but could you be moving up faster with less resistance and less hesitation? And the only other thing I would add to that is in terms of this, of like becoming that second person, basically. I know I keep mentioning it, and I know that there's tons of these out there, and I'm sure Tyler does something very similar to this in the mentorship aspect. An easy way to find out who do you want to be and who you are right now, because you have to know who you are now in order to draw a line from 1 to 2, is a series of questions. You just kind of ask yourself very candidly, very honestly, who am I? How do I see myself? How do other people see me? Like all that stuff that we've talked about in the past. And again, there's these resources that exist out there, so I'm not going to spend too much time on listing them out, but you have to figure out who you are right now. Who's your current self, so to speak? And then you start drafting out, who do I want to be? And then you can kind of create that Venn diagram and play the game of vices and virtues, right? Profits and loss. What do I have that I already need? Great. Okay, what do I not have yet? Okay, bang. What's in the way of that? And once you guys start looking at evolving your habits and evolving yourself and therefore your, the effect that you have as a person on your team and on your clients, and because that's what we're talking about, leading like a leader. As if you want to evolve yourself into the leader that then can lead people because now you're that person, it doesn't have to be this like, oh, that would be nice if only it were possible. There are clear-cut, really not even that complicated, it's just a matter of discipline, ways to actually do it. There are programs out there, there are people out there that will help you. There are books, as you guys keep, bringing it. Like there's so many ways to make this real that I don't want someone to hear this episode and be like, that was great, that was inspiring, and then just leave it at that. It was just that episode that I really liked. If you want to make this stuff real, reach out to Tyler, like reach out to somebody who can help you with this and start taking real world action. It's more scary than it is difficult. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. And also, guys, like if there is a person within arm's reach, like someone you work for or a trainer you admire close by, or, or it's online, right? Just, you can reach out to people. Like, I think one of the biggest compliments that people give us is they ask us for help. That's the biggest compliment you get as a mentor, as a teacher. And I would say, like I benefited so much from having a person I could literally study and watch for 10 years. Someone who was a good man, was a good businessman, who was a good dog trainer, who was good with people. And he had the characteristics of something that I admired, right? And I was able to study them. And sometimes we may not have that ability. We study the books that people read. We study people who have passed. We study, certain videos or things like that, right? But I think studying people who have the characteristics that you want to have is really important. And if you have the opportunity to have an in-person mentor, go and find them, go and look for them, because they're out there. You just have to ask or reach out to them and see, like, can we have lunch? Can we have dinner? Or could I chat with you? Could you help me once a month? Could I pay you to help me once a month? Like little tiny things like that. You don't have to do this alone. And a lot of growth, some of it happens alone, but a lot of growth happens as a community with others and people. That's at least my testimony from my life experience. So
yeah, I think it's similar to parenting. It's similar to seeking, it's similar to, I think, any form of wanting to improve relationship, like with your spouse, with God, with whatever, with it's kind of this middle ground. And this is what I struggle with, which is why I fall into that role. What did you call it, Tyler? Like the protector. But I understand that this is an issue that I'm actively working on, because I don't want to have this downfall. I understand that the two-way street works like this. You have to be willing to offer, but the other person has to be willing to accept. It's the whole, like, you can lead a horse to water type thing. So when we're talking about balancing authority with fairness, I think that's essentially what we've talked about for the entirety of this episode, in terms of making sure your staff have what they need, but ultimately it's their job to do the job. If they don't have what they need, that's when you step in, right? And Tyler's like the real parent. I have my nephews living with me, but I've never like raised young children. These guys are 16 and 17, and the lesson that I'm learning with them, and McKenna is learning with them, is, they're children. We have rules in the house and all that stuff, but they're so close to adulthood that the middle ground here is, my job is to offer you opportunities to expand your life, basically, like learn new things, gain experiences and all that stuff. But you ultimately have to take it. I'm not going to force you. I'm not going to beg you to do things that are good for you. I'm going to try to lay out the case as best I can. And I'm going to try to make sure that you have the tools necessary to do so, including the tools necessary to be able to comprehend why this would be good for you. Spend the time, have the conversations, all that stuff. But ultimately, it's on you, right? And I realize it's funny I say that, because I struggle with that as a boss, but it's just in my mind so much because I know I struggle. So I just wanted to make sure that was out there, that you have to be able to balance what is my job, what isn't my job. Because if you do too much for people, not only then, it's not just that now they're like being lazy or whatever. It's now they may very well be inequipped because they've never had to do their own job.
Now you like make them a toddler, kind of like people do with their dogs, right?
Exactly.
You make them a toddler. Cool. Any other points you guys want to make on balancing authority and having fairness with our teams or the people that we lead? No? Awesome, guys. I mean, I think we made some really great points. Again, this is a hard episode because you have to gain experience. You have to make mistakes. The idea of coaching and mentorship is really like, how do we make the minimal amount of mistakes where we don't like shoot ourselves in the foot, and have to start all the way over. But I know there's been scenarios in my leadership journey that I've had to start over, legit. Like Mariano saw me at the end before I started my own company. He saw where I was, and if it wasn't for those hard life lessons that I learned, I would not be in the positions that I am. As I'm sure you guys have many stories of growth and failure and learning and things like that. But yeah, guys, don't beat yourself up if you're not here yet. Take this whole 3-part series as just kind of like a marker for, step 1, step 2, step 3, right? Like give yourself, don't think you got to get this done in a year. Don't think you have to master this stuff in a short period of time. Give yourself grace, give yourself 3, 4, 5 years, plan this stuff out, and just put your reps in and learn. And there are books and people you can learn from. But yeah, Do you have any final words, Tyler, before we sign off?
Yeah, I think final thing I want to say is just, unless you're like probably like a complete narcissist, you're probably never going to feel worthy or good enough to be like really in the role of leader. I always quote my wife here because she once said to me, referring to imposter syndrome, that how can it be a syndrome if everybody has it? Right? It's just being human, right? I think it's the syndrome is if you didn't, right? Like, what would that say? And you can look at, I know some people who see me only on social media, and then they get to know me personally, and they're like, oh, it's really refreshing to see that you struggle with some of the same things I struggle with. Or they might look at you guys and, you've got this podcast and kind of, I remember when I first met you, I barely knew who you were. And now you've like run seminars with Michael and other, Forrest and other like big name people, and like, kind of came out of nowhere. People can look at it and be like, wow, these guys, like, holy moly, like I can never be like them. Everybody's struggling with the same stuff, right? Like, Mariano, you've mentioned several times about just your church group or, God or whatever. I'm not a particularly religious person. I do belong to a small church organization. I appreciate the values and community of church. And I was talking to a good friend of mine who's sort of in the leadership team of the organization about Jesus and what this all meant. So preface this with, again, I'm not what you would consider like a traditional believer. But what I said to him was, for me, I think when sometimes people look at somebody like Jesus or anybody who's in a ruler of a country or a president or whatever, and you think that they're this person that's like different, right? Like, they're built differently than the rest of us. It makes us feel so other than. And I think for me, part of, the benefit of not necessarily having to believe in all of the sort of magical stuff that might be in the Bible is, to me, if I look at somebody like Jesus and think, no, this dude like probably sometimes looked at another woman and was like, probably sometimes woke up in the morning and did not want to get out of bed. Probably sometimes was dealing with his disciples and felt really, really annoyed by them. You know what I mean? And he probably had to struggle and wrestle with all of those things and think about also what it meant for him to be a good leader in his role, because after all, he was just a human. And for me, what I said to him was, that makes the whole thing even more incredible to me when I think of it that way. Yeah, but makes him more incredible as a human, as a person, right? And so again, if we're doing this whole idea of like modeling who we want to be, just recognize that if you're looking up to anybody, they're just like you. They have inner demons and things that they've struggled with, and days that they don't want to get out of bed, and days that they beat themselves up over things, and issues of self-worth, and all of those things that all of us struggle with. I struggle all the time with self-worth and identity and things like that. So again, I just want to say that because I think sometimes that can be an impediment for some people to not sort of get started or work towards these things, because it's like, oh, but I'm not like him or her. But it's like, no, you are. Like, it's no different, right? I assure you, any major athlete who's climbed their way to success, they dealt with a lot of failures, and they dealt with a lot of doubt, and they dealt with a lot of not feeling worthy or feeling like it was never going to happen for them. They just had to keep pushing through and trying to do the right thing. And podcasts like this, I think, help. Some of the books that we've recommended, I think, really help. Part of the reason I'm listening to Discipline is Destiny right now is because there's been certain aspects of my life that I felt the need that I needed to get more disciplined about. And just regularly plugging that into my ear, it just keeps it on the forefront of my mind. So it doesn't just be one of these things that I thought about one day in the shower, but then never brought it to fruition. Listening to the audiobook is an exercise to make sure that I don't forget that I want to keep working towards these goals. And I need those reminders, and I need that inspiration. And so, yeah, we all struggle. Like, we're all far from perfect. So don't let that be an excuse to not sort of aim high.
Yeah, that's I said it before in other podcasts, and I will repeat it again. One of the most inspiring parts of doing this podcast and getting to meet the people that we've looked up to for so many years in the dog training industry, you being one of them, is the humanity of every single person that we admire to be able to sit in the same room with them, to sit at the table with them, to share drinks with them, to eat food with them, and to hear the human side of all of this it's actually like, that's what I think we're all trying to tell you guys is like, just stay on your path, stay trucking along, keep putting your reps in. You're going to have, good days and bad days. And really the people who were successful are the ones that kept pushing. Right. And so we're so grateful, and I'm speaking for Mariano, but please say what you want to say, but like, we're so grateful to be able to know you guys and to be able to have the success that we've had. And I'm sure you have a similar story. We're the humanity is so beautiful. So thank you for joining us on this podcast, Tyler. Anything you want to say, Mariano, before we sign off?
Thank you, man. We love you.
We love you, man. All right. My name is Brent Labrada. That's Mariano Alvarez. And thank you again to our friend Tyler Muto for joining us on
Thank you guys.
Part 3, Lead Like a Leader. We'll talk to you next time. Peace.
Thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers, for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
We really hope that you enjoyed this episode and can't wait to be back with you guys. Be sure to follow us at Dog Trainers Podcast on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And don't forget to punch the hell out of that subscribe button and leave us a review.
Remember, guys, this is your podcast. You're the best listeners in the world, and we'll see you next time.